We're looking at the OCR Markets in Action syllabus, and we're going to start by looking at competitive markets. So firstly, what is a market? There's three basic characteristics that you need to know. One is that it's a physical place or a mechanism. So for example, it could be the internet or it could be an actual shop, where buyers and sellers meet or contact each other. That's very important. There's got to be a meeting or a contact between buyers and sellers with a willingness to trade or exchange. So that's another key concept. Trade or exchange goes on, usually for money, although it could be for barter, where you simply swap one good for another good. Price is going to be set in that market, and the price will be set where the buyers are willing and able to purchase at that particular price, and the sellers are also willing and able to sell their goods at that particular price. And if the purchasers and the sellers are willing and able to purchase and supply at the same price, then that price is going to, what we call, clear the market. All that is supplied is going to be demanded. Now we're going to start to look at the demand curve, and it's always best to use the term effective demand, which is basically meaning that they are willing and able to buy at that price. If there's only a willingness but not an ability to buy, then we're going to call that notional demand. The demand for any good or service is going to be determined by lots of factors, including the following. The first one is the price of the good or the service itself. Then you have a lot of what we call non-price factors, non-price determinants. These are things like income, prices of other goods and services that are related to that good, the weather, maybe taste or fashion or advertising, future price that is expected for the good, and also population. Let's look at the demand schedule or the demand curve. Now this is drawn by looking at what happens to the demand for a good when the price changes. We are assuming that all the other determinants of demand, things like income, price of other goods, are kept constant, and that is called ceteris paribus. Now basically, if the price of a good falls, then the demand for that good is going to rise. If the price of the good rises, then the demand for that good is going to fall. Now technically, when we draw the demand curve, we move along the demand curve whenever price goes up or down, and it is known as an increase or a reduction in quantity demanded. Now we need to understand why the demand curve slopes downwards to the right with respect to price. The argument is that as we consume goods, then we receive a benefit or some sort of satisfaction from consuming those goods. As we consume more of them, the extra benefit that we get is going to fall. This is known as the marginal benefit or the marginal satisfaction. And you can think of it in terms of a drink, for example. When you're really thirsty, the first drink is going to give you a lot of satisfaction or extra benefit. The second one is going to give you some, but it's not going to be as much as the first one. The third one is not going to give you as much as the second one, etc. Now, therefore, because that marginal benefit falls as we consume more, as quantity goes up, we have to have a lower price in order to persuade us to buy more of the good. We're now going to look at what happens to the demand schedule when some of the non-price determinants change. What's going to happen each time is that the demand curve is going to physically shift, and one of the tasks you're going to be asked to do is to determine whether it's shifting outwards or whether it's shifting inwards. Now the first one is to look at people's incomes, and if people's incomes rose, then it is likely that more of that good is going to be demanded at each and every price, and so the demand curve is physically going to shift outwards, and we call this an increase in demand, remember, not an increase in quantity demanded. Now when income changes, we need to be careful that we are able to distinguish between what we call normal goods and what we call inferior goods. A normal good is a good which, if income rises, the demand will increase, and if income falls, the demand will decrease. An inferior good is one where if income increases, then demand will start to decrease, but as income falls, demand will increase. Now, such goods could be basic range of any of the supermarkets. Now, one of the key things to remember here is that what is inferior for some of us will not actually be inferior for all of us, and it might be a normal good for some people. So you can't give examples to define what a normal or an inferior good is. You have to relate it to what happens to demand when income changes. The next factor that will shift a demand curve is the price of other goods. Now again, there are two types of goods that we need to be concerned with, and one of the best ways of working this out is to ask yourself what is happening in the market for this other good, and then say, how is that going to affect the demand for our good? So the first example would be what we call a substitute good. So these are goods that are substitutes, so if I buy more of one of them, I'll buy less of the other one. Now, if the price of, for example, Coca-Cola rose, then we work out that the demand for Coca-Cola would fall. That's a normal demand curve for Coke. But as the demand for Coke falls, the demand for Pepsi, the good that we're considering, will rise, and therefore in the market for Pepsi the demand curve will shift outwards as the price of Coke rises. The next type of good that's related is what we call a complementary good, and these are goods that are bought together. Sometimes we say that they're in joint demand. Now, given an example, this would be, for example, golf clubs and golf balls. So if I buy more golf clubs, then I might have to buy more golf balls. Okay, so if the demand for golf clubs rose because the price of those golf clubs fell, then the demand for our golf balls would also rise, and therefore that would shift the demand curve physically outwards. So therefore the demand for golf balls in this example will increase because the price of golf clubs fell. We're now going to turn to the supply curve. Now this refers to the amount that firms plan to sell in markets at any given price over a particular time period. And yet again, it's better to discuss what we call effective supply, that is, how much firms are willing and able to supply at each and every price level. Now, the determinants of supply are going to include the price of the good, the price of the factors of production that make up the good, land, labour, capital, enterprise, productivity levels, expected future price, and technology. The supply curve is drawn upward sloping with respect to price. Now this is because as the firms are being asked to supply more, their costs are going to start to rise. Now the reason for this, and this is very important, is that they have to start to use less efficient workers, and they have to bring in less efficient raw materials, etc. And so therefore, for that reason alone, they will find that the unit cost, the cost of making one good, is going to go up. Therefore, if you ask them to produce one more and they find that the unit cost has gone up, they will only do so if you offer them a higher price. That's why the supply curve slopes upwards with respect to price. Now we come to the actual movements of supply curves. The first one that we're going to look at is going to be the cost of the factors of production, for example, wages. Now, if wages rose, that will mean that the cost of making one of the units from the firm's point of view is also going to rise. And therefore, if you consider the quantity axis and you look at any particular quantity, whereas previously they were willing and able to supply it at a certain price, if their wages go up, then they'll only be willing to supply that quantity at a higher price. And so therefore the supply curve is going to physically shift upwards to the left by the amount of the increase in wages. The next factor to consider is productivity. Now, productivity is the output per worker, so it's how many goods each worker can actually produce in any particular time period. And the best way again to think of this is that if their productivity rose, then basically for the same number of workers for which you are paying the same amount, they are going to have an increase in the quantity. So at each and every price there's going to be a greater amount of quantity being supplied into the marketplace and therefore the supply curve is going to shift to the right by the amount of that productivity increase. We're now going to come and look at equilibrium in the market, which is, after all, why we've derived our demand and supply curves in the first place. So remember that the demand curve, which is downward sloping, shows how much that consumers are willing and able to buy at each and every price, and the supply curve, upward sloping, shows you how much firms or suppliers are willing and able to supply at each and every price. Now in equilibrium, there has to be no tendency to change. That's the best definition of equilibrium to use. Now, whenever there's no tendency to change, or the market is in equilibrium, that is going to occur where the amount demanded is equal to the amount supplied. So that is going to occur at some equilibrium price and some equilibrium quantity in the marketplace. One way to consider this is to ask, well, what would happen if the price in the market was such that demand and supply were not equal? If they weren't equal, so for example, if the demand exceeded the supply, then what's going to happen is that the firms are going to find that their stocks of finished goods that they hold are going to be run down, because they have to keep using those stocks to supply that excess demand. If that happens, they are going to want to expand their output. Now, with a normal supply curve, they will only expand output if the price goes up. However, that rise in price will not only stimulate an increase in quantity supplied, which remember moves you up the supply curve, but at the same time it's going to lead to a fall in quantity demanded, which moves you along the demand curve, and there's going to be a reduction in quantity demanded. So now we come to look at the surpluses. You need to remember that the demand curve reflects the value of the marginal benefit for the consumer. Now, if the equilibrium price is lower than the value of the marginal benefit, then obviously that's going to mean that the consumer has what we're going to call in economics a surplus. The marginal benefit for that consumer is going to be greater than the amount that he has to pay for it. So you need to consider basically any quantity level, but if you start with the first one, the first good that is bought, the first quantity, then you will see from a normal demand curve, downward sloping, that the marginal benefit is quite high, but the price that they have to charge in the market is much lower at PE. And it's the difference between the marginal benefit and the price that gives you the consumer surplus. So finally we look at the producer surplus. And it's very similar. Remember that the firms will be having costs involved in their production, and so therefore the supply curve reflects the marginal cost to the firm of producing one more good. So if the price that they're achieving in the marketplace is higher than the marginal cost of producing that good, then effectively they are getting a surplus as well. So a producer surplus is the fact that equilibrium price is greater than marginal cost. Again, you just take any quantity and you can see that the price PE is going to be higher than MC1, and that difference between PE and MC1 is the producer surplus. When you do that for each and every quantity level, you get that triangle that is shown in the slide.